In 32 years of studying nuclear strategy, I have learned one thing. The most dangerous words are not shouted from a podium. They are released quietly. At 6:47 this morning, the Kremlin press office issued 11 words that governments across the world have spent 3 decades hoping they would never have to read. The president has authorized the activation of updated nuclear deterrence doctrine. 11 words. No press conference. No televised address. No missiles rolling through Red Square. Just a short sentence from a building in Moscow. And within moments, nuclear command authorities around the world understood exactly what it meant. This was not a warning about a possible change. It was the change itself. Russia has formally lowered the threshold at which it may consider the use of nuclear weapons. Not threatened to lower it. Not suggested it might lower it. Lowered it. And that is why this morning may be remembered as one of the most dangerous nuclear moments since the Cold War. And inside the Pentagon, the building that has maintained the architecture of nuclear deterrence for 80 years, the response was immediate, institutional, and the most serious American military posture adjustment since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The United States has moved to DEFCON 3. For viewers who are not familiar with what that means in operational terms, DEFCON 3 is not a symbolic gesture. It is not a diplomatic signal. It is the activation of specific, pre-planned military readiness measures across every branch of the American armed forces simultaneously. Measures that bring nuclear-capable assets to a state of readiness. Measures that reduce launch preparation time from hours to minutes. DEFCON 3 means America's nuclear forces are ready. Not aimed, not launched. Ready. And the distance between ready and aimed is the narrowest it has been since October 1962. Tonight, I want to walk you through exactly what Putin's Doctrine activation means. I want to explain exactly what DEFCON 3 requires American forces to do right now. And I want to break down exactly how 2 nuclear superpowers manage, or fail to manage, the most dangerous escalation ladder in human history. Tonight, I want to answer 4 questions that no mainstream commentator is addressing with the honesty this moment demands. First, what does Russia's updated nuclear doctrine actually say? Not the diplomatic summary, the operational content. What specific thresholds has Putin lowered? What specific conditions now authorize Russian nuclear employment? And why does the specific language of the activation order tell us this is not a bluff designed for diplomatic consumption? Second, what does DEFCON 3 actually require? What specific operational measures are American nuclear forces executing right now? The bombers, the submarines, the land-based missiles, the command and control architecture. And why is the transition from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3 not a gradual increase in readiness, but a qualitative jump in nuclear posture that every adversary reads as a direct signal? Third, how do 2 nuclear superpowers de-escalate from this position? What are the specific diplomatic, military, and political mechanisms that have historically prevented nuclear crises from crossing the threshold that neither side can survive? And why are the conditions that made those mechanisms work in previous crises less reliable tonight than at any point since 1962? And fourth, what does a world that successfully de-escalates from DEFCON 3 look like on the other side? What concessions, what repositioning, what permanent alterations to the global security architecture does Russia extract from a crisis it created and controlled? And what does the precedent of successful nuclear coercion mean for every future confrontation between a nuclear power and the alliance system that has organized global security for 80 years? Stay with me, because the answers to those questions define the most consequential strategic moment of the 21st century. If you came here for analysis that treats the most serious strategic development of our lifetime with the seriousness it deserves, subscribe now. Hit like. Share this with everyone you know who is trying to understand what DEFCON 3 actually means and why the next 72 hours matter more than any news cycle in a generation. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. Now let us get into this completely. Let me start with the doctrine itself, because mainstream coverage has already begun the process of contextualizing Putin's activation order as rhetorical escalation, a signaling measure, a diplomatic warning, not operational implementation. That contextualization is dangerously wrong, and I want to explain precisely why. Because the specific language of Russia's updated nuclear deterrence doctrine, when compared against the doctrine it replaces, contains threshold changes that are operational in character, not rhetorical. Russia's previous nuclear doctrine, the 2020 Basic Principles of State Policy on Nuclear Deterrence, authorized nuclear employment under 4 conditions. First, an incoming ballistic missile attack confirmed by early warning systems. Second, an attack on Russian territory or allied territory using nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. Third, an attack on Russian nuclear forces or nuclear command and control infrastructure. And fourth, conventional aggression against Russia that threatens the existence of the state. The updated doctrine activated this morning contains 2 additional authorization conditions that the previous version did not include. The first new condition authorizes nuclear employment in response to conventional military strikes against Russian territory that cause what the doctrine terms, and I want to quote the specific language precisely, critical damage to defense infrastructure. Critical damage to defense infrastructure, not existential threat to the state, not imminent defeat of Russian armed forces. Critical damage to defense infrastructure. That threshold is so broad in its potential application that it encompasses virtually any significant conventional military strike against Russian military assets on Russian soil. And that is a category of action that American and NATO military planning has treated as a conventional escalation option rather than a nuclear trigger. That planning assumption is now invalidated. The second new condition authorizes nuclear employment in response to what the doctrine terms aggression conducted by a non-nuclear state with the support or participation of a nuclear state. That language directly targets the American practice of providing weapons, intelligence, and operational support to Ukraine while maintaining the legal fiction of non-participation in the conflict. Washington has spent 2 years carefully managing its Ukraine support to remain below the threshold of direct participation that Russian doctrine previously defined as a nuclear trigger. That threshold has just been moved below the level of support America is currently providing. The operational significance of these 2 additions cannot be overstated, and I want to state it with the directness it deserves. Russia has formally declared that actions America is currently taking right now, today, are within the authorization envelope of its nuclear employment doctrine. Not actions America might take in an escalated future scenario. Actions America is taking today. That is what DEFCON 3 is responding to, not a threat of future escalation. A doctrine that has formally placed present American behavior inside Russia's nuclear authorization framework. Now, I want to walk through what DEFCON 3 actually requires American military forces to execute. Because the public understanding of the DEFCON system as a simple readiness scale, gradually moving from green to red, misrepresents the operational reality. Moving from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3 is not just an adjustment in tone. It is not just a warning. It is not a symbolic posture. DEFCON 3 is a qualitative threshold. It is a specific set of pre-planned operational measures that activate simultaneously across every nuclear-capable element of the American military force structure the moment the order is issued. Let me walk through what is happening right now. Start with the Strategic Bomber Force. At DEFCON 4, the normal peacetime readiness level, America's B-52H and B-2 Spirit strategic bombers are maintained at their home bases in a readiness state that allows them to be armed and airborne within hours of an order to launch. At DEFCON 3, a significant portion of the bomber force is placed on ground alert, armed, fueled, crews in the aircraft or immediately adjacent, capable of being airborne within 15 minutes of a launch order. The B-52Hs at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota and Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana are currently sitting on alert pads with nuclear gravity bombs and air-launched cruise missiles loaded. The B-2s at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and the Zhuan, the aircraft specifically designed to penetrate Russian air defenses and deliver weapons against hardened underground targets. I see are on the same 15-minute ground alert. Now look at the ballistic missile submarine force. At DEFCON 4, American Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines maintain their normal patrol cycle. Roughly 2/3 of the force at sea at any given time, 1/3 in port for maintenance and crew rotation. At DEFCON 3, the submarines currently in port are ordered to sea on an accelerated timeline. Maintenance cycles are suspended. Crew rotations are accelerated. The objective is to maximize the number of submarines on patrol, and therefore invulnerable to a first strike as rapidly as operationally feasible. Each Ohio-class submarine carries 20 Trident II D5 ballistic missiles. Each Trident II carries between 4 and 8 independently targetable warheads. A single Ohio-class submarine on patrol represents a nuclear strike capability that exceeds the total nuclear employment of every war in human history combined. There are currently 14 Ohio-class submarines assigned to the strategic nuclear mission. They are going to sea. Now look at the land-based missile force. At DEFCON 4, America's 400 Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles sit in hardened silos across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. They are maintained in a launch-ready state that can deliver warheads to Russian targets within 30 minutes of a launch order under normal conditions. At DEFCON 3, the security posture around those silos is elevated. The communication links between the missiles and their launch control facilities are placed on enhanced monitoring, and the personnel who manage those missiles are placed on extended alert rotations that keep them at their posts continuously rather than on the normal rotation schedule. Then there is the command and control architecture. At DEFCON 3, the airborne command post aircraft, the E-6B Mercury aircraft that provide an airborne nuclear command and control capability survivable against a first strike that destroys ground-based command centers that are placed on continuous airborne alert. Right now, an E-6B Mercury is airborne somewhere over the continental United States. It carries the communications equipment and the authority to relay nuclear launch orders to submarines and land-based missiles if ground-based command centers are destroyed. That aircraft has been airborne since the DEFCON 3 order was issued. It will not land until the alert level changes. The cumulative operational picture of DEFCON 3 is this: a nuclear force posture that has compressed the timeline for nuclear employment from hours to minutes across every leg of the strategic triad simultaneously. Russia's early warning systems are detecting every element of this posture change in real time. And Russia's own nuclear forces are responding with mirror image readiness measures that American early warning systems are detecting simultaneously. 2 nuclear arsenals, thousands of warheads, minutes to launch on both sides. That is what 11 words in a Kremlin press release produced. Now I want to address the de-escalation question directly because it is the question that matters most right now. And the one mainstream commentary is handling with the least analytical honesty. The standard reassurance commentators offer in moments like this is that nuclear crises have been navigated successfully before. They point to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. They say it provides a template for managed de-escalation. They say rational actors on both sides will follow that template. But that reassurance rests on an analogy that must be examined honestly. Because the conditions that made de-escalation possible in 1962 are not fully present tonight. In 1962, the crisis had a specific and identifiable trigger: Soviet missiles in Cuba. Their removal provided a concrete and verifiable de-escalation pathway. Kennedy wanted the missiles removed. Khrushchev wanted American assurances against an invasion of Cuba and the quiet removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The exchange was specific, verifiable, executable within a defined timeline. Tonight's crisis has no equivalent specific trigger. Putin's doctrine activation is not a response to one identifiable American action whose reversal would provide a clear de-escalation pathway. It is a response to the cumulative trajectory of American and NATO policy across 2 years of the Ukrainian conflict. And reversing that trajectory would require concessions that the current American political environment cannot authorize, and that NATO allies whose security depends on American commitment cannot accept. The de-escalation pathway in 1962 was narrow, but navigable. Both sides could identify what they needed from the other. Both sides could verify delivery. Tonight, the de-escalation pathway is narrow and structurally obstructed by domestic political constraints on both sides at the same time. Putin cannot de-escalate without extracting concessions that validate the doctrine activation as a successful coercive strategy. Because de-escalating without concessions would demonstrate that the doctrine activation was a bluff, and that would permanently destroy its deterrent value in every future crisis. Trump cannot provide the concessions that would validate Putin's strategy, because providing them under nuclear duress would establish a precedent that invites identical coercion in every future confrontation with every nuclear-armed adversary. Both sides need the other to move first. Neither side can afford to move first. That structural deadlock is the most dangerous feature of the current situation. More dangerous than the weapons themselves, because it removes the rational actor calculation that nuclear deterrence theory depends upon and replaces it with a game of institutional credibility. And the stakes of that game exceed what either side can rationally afford to lose. The back-channel communications currently occurring through Vienna, through Ankara, and through whatever third-party diplomatic infrastructure has survived the deterioration of direct US-Russia communication are not negotiating a solution yet. They are searching for a face-saving framework, a framework that allows both sides to step back from a position neither can hold indefinitely without making that step backward look like capitulation. That search has a timeline. It is measured by how long domestic political systems on both sides can sustain the pressure of a DEFCON 3 posture without demanding action. Either escalatory action or conciliatory action. And either one could be more than the strategic situation can safely accommodate. In Beijing, the DEFCON 3 announcement has produced a strategic calculation of extraordinary complexity and consequence. China possesses approximately 400 nuclear warheads. That force is sufficient for minimum deterrence against any single adversary. But it becomes strategically exposed in a world where American and Russian nuclear forces are simultaneously at elevated readiness. The Chinese calculation tonight is not about whether to intervene in the US-Russia nuclear standoff. It is about what a world that successfully navigates this crisis looks like, and whether China's own nuclear posture needs fundamental reassessment in light of what tonight demonstrates about the willingness of nuclear powers to activate doctrine for coercive effect. The answer Chinese strategic planners are reaching is the one American arms control advocates feared most. If nuclear doctrine activation produces strategic concessions, if Putin's 11 words extract from Washington the concessions that 2 years of conventional military engagement could not, then China's own nuclear posture, currently calibrated for minimum deterrence, isn't the for Coercion and aware until Mao any for the coercive role that tonight demonstrates nuclear weapons can play. The Chinese nuclear buildup that American intelligence has been tracking for 3 years is about to accelerate. Not because China wants nuclear war, because China has just watched nuclear coercion work. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the NATO allies, whose security architecture rests on American extended nuclear deterrence, are conducting the most fundamental reassessment of that architecture since the end of the Cold War. The question every European capital is asking tonight is one that has never required a serious answer before. If the United States is at DEFCON 3, if American nuclear forces are at elevated readiness in response to a Russian Doctrine activation, what does that mean for the credibility of American nuclear guarantees to European allies whose territory sits between the two arsenals? The answer honest European strategic analysts are reaching is uncomfortable. American extended nuclear deterrence has always rested on the assumption that the United States would risk nuclear exchange to defend European allies. Tonight's DEFCON 3 posture confirms that American nuclear forces are responsive to Russian escalation. It does not confirm that American nuclear employment would be triggered by Russian conventional aggression against a NATO ally. Because the specific conditions that produced DEFCON 3 tonight involve direct US-Russia confrontation, not the indirect alliance defense scenario that European security planning depends upon. That distinction between American responsiveness to direct nuclear threat and American commitment to nuclear defense of allies, and is the crack in the extended deterrence foundation that European governments are examining under bright light tonight for the first time. In Pyongyang, Tehran, and every other capital that has pursued or considered pursuing nuclear weapons against American opposition, tonight's events are being absorbed as the most compelling validation of the nuclear deterrence logic that American non-proliferation policy has spent decades arguing against. Nuclear weapons work not as instruments of war, as instruments of coercion. And tonight's DEFCON 3 announcement is the most visible demonstration of that principle in 60 years. Let me be direct about what successful de-escalation from tonight's crisis actually requires. Because mainstream commentary treats de-escalation as a return to the status quo ante. It is not. Every previous nuclear crisis that was successfully de-escalated produced a world permanently different from the world that preceded it. The Cuban Missile Crisis produced the Moscow-Washington hotline. It produced the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It produced a fundamental reassessment of Soviet strategic ambitions that shaped the next decade of Cold War management. The de-escalation of tonight's crisis will produce its own permanent alterations. The specific alterations will depend on which side blinks first in the back-channel negotiations currently underway. But the range of available outcomes, from maximum American concession to maximum Russian concession, shares one feature. The world that exists after this crisis will be a world in which nuclear doctrine activation has been demonstrated as a viable coercive instrument that produces strategic results. That demonstration cannot be undone by the specific terms of the de-escalation agreement. It exists as operational knowledge, absorbed by every nuclear power, every aspiring nuclear power, and every government that has relied on American nuclear guarantees for its security, regardless of what press releases say when the crisis formally ends. The genie of successful nuclear coercion, once released, does not return to its bottle because the crisis that released it was eventually resolved. It shapes every subsequent confrontation. Every future crisis between a nuclear power and the alliance system that has organized global security. Every future calculation by every government about whether American security guarantees are worth the cost of maintaining them. And every future decision by governments currently without nuclear weapons about whether the non-proliferation regime serves their security interests or constrains them. Tonight's crisis will end. The DEFCON level will return to 4. Diplomatic language will describe the resolution in terms designed to give both sides a face-saving narrative. And the world will exhale. But the world that exhales will be permanently different from the world that held its breath. Because It will be a world that knows from direct operational observation that nuclear coercion works. And that knowledge is the most dangerous strategic development of the 21st century. I have spent 32 years studying how nuclear deterrence works. The theory is elegant. The logic is internally consistent. The mathematical game theory that underlies it has been refined by the brightest strategic minds of 3 generations. And at its core, nuclear deterrence rests on a single assumption: that rational actors on both sides will always calculate that the cost of nuclear employment exceeds any achievable benefit. Tonight's DEFCON 3 posture does not challenge that assumption. It reveals how close to its edge we are operating. 11 words in a Kremlin press release. 2 nuclear arsenals at elevated readiness. Thousands of warheads minutes from launch. And a de-escalation pathway obstructed by the domestic political constraints of 2 governments that cannot afford to be seen to capitulate and cannot afford to escalate. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. We are on day 1. The question I want you to think about and answer in the comments is this: if Putin's Doctrine activation successfully extracts strategic concessions from Washington, if nuclear coercion is seen to work, what does that mean for the next nuclear power that faces a confrontation with the American alliance system and calculates that 11 words in a press release are worth more than 2 years of conventional military engagement? Because from where I sit, after 32 years of studying nuclear strategy, the most dangerous consequence of tonight is not the weapons ready to launch. It is the lesson every government on Earth is learning right now about what those weapons are actually for. Tell me what you think. Like and share this if the analysis delivered the depth this moment demands. Subscribe for the work that goes where the mainstream will not. I will see you in the next one.